So this evening, we are very pleased to have Sean Conway back in town for his talk entitled The Color and Character of the Ottawa Valley Political Tradition. When I asked Sean several months ago if he would be interested in offering this lecture, he enthusiastically said yes. Now, having put dozens of hours of research into this project, I'm not sure that he is still as enthusiastic about the assignment. However, I am confident, and I've spent a couple of hours with him this afternoon, that he will deliver a punchy and informative talk that will be both entertaining and informative. I say that because I know of no one who has a greater respect and interest in Ottawa Valley political history than our former member of provincial parliament. That point was best made at an event I was at a few years ago when the Churchill Society honored Sean with a prestigious award for his work in forming public policy. And at that event, former Ontario Premier David Peterson said, and I quote, "Since Sean left Queen's Park, no one has ever used the library again in the Ontario legislature." And I believe that may be true. An absolute bookworm who has combed over dozens of history books, newspaper articles to prepare for this talk, Sean will introduce or reacquaint us with some of the great political figures who were connected to the Ottawa Valley. So please welcome home, Sean Conway.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Ladies and gentlemen, I brought my clock for all the good that'll do. Where's Mike Johnson? I saw him here. Good to see you, sir. And like some of you, I've got water in the basement, so if I seem a little distracted tonight, I'm learning some things about hydrology that only Terry McCann learned at that Nova Scotia University that he went to. I am delighted to be here tonight. Jamie is actually telling the truth, as he didn't always do when he was running the news programs over there at the local radio station. And I am going to try to behave myself tonight, and I do want to make sure that I leave some time and opportunity for any questions or comments, just because I say something, of course, as Mike Ryan knows, there's no reason why anybody would believe it. And this really is an interesting story, and I've thought for a long time that there's a good book in this. And I'm going to cite a couple of well-known Canadian writers who've actually touched on the subject in novel form. So what I want to do tonight is just to put a few things on the table. The time period I'm going to look at is sort of 1820, 1830 to about 1960, on the theory that ne'er of the living should the living judge, too blind the affection, too fresh the grudge. Whether or not I actually keep to that injunction is another matter. Politics being politics, you know, you have to be careful that even within families, as I will observe here later tonight, there are sometimes creative tensions on these matters. And I do want to just look at selected incidents and personalities that speak to, I think, some important themes about the world at which most of us grew up in. And I think, like all of us in our own environments, we sometimes are so close to it we don't see some distinguishing characteristics. And I've been away from the business of elected and public life now for almost 15 years, and some things are a little clearer than they certainly appeared to be 42 years ago when I began my improbable journey. And it is true for many people who are not here tonight. Well, I hope the hell he's learned something that in those intervening years. It's too bad Lorne Foran is not here tonight, Terry McCann, one of my great friends. And actually, when I was preparing these remarks, I kept channeling Lorne, because for those of you who know, I don't think there was ever a better and more reliable storyteller than Lorne. He not only had great content, but he had a marvelous way in which to convey it. And every story began and ended with the same, "Oh, please God, don't repeat this to anybody," you know. And I can remember sitting out at Lake Claire on more than one occasion with Joan Finnegan, who I kept saying, and Joan was a very good friend of mine, and she caused Lorne and I know a little bit of heartache, because really we would say to Joan, "You can't say that, Joan. You can't put that in a book. Just because some old-timer in Sheenborough said it doesn't mean that it's true. And I guess Not for Nothing was her best-selling book entitled And Some of the Stories I Told You Were True. So tonight, again, I want to just look at the sweep of 150 years. Someone once said that history was the record of the encounter of character and circumstance. So I hope to, in these minutes tonight, walk you through some of the circumstances that brought people to the Ottawa Valley in the time period that I'm addressing, and some of the characters that emerged from that. The story begins, and I'm really reluctant to say this tonight, given what I've been doing the last couple of days, with the river, the Great River, as it was called for many years, the Grand River. We know it as the Ottawa, but if you were looking at the historical literature of the late 18th and early 19th century, you are much more likely going to see it referred to as the Grand River as much as the Ottawa. And I was saying to young Mr. Bramburger that tonight we're going to talk about the political tradition, mostly post-1800. But one of the most important political meetings that ever occurred in this region occurred 402 years ago next month, when the great Champlain met the great Algonquin chief Tessowat at Morrison's Island for a very important encounter that made the French and Indian relationship in 17th century Canada a very stable and much more credible one than it might otherwise have been the case. One of the interesting things about that meeting at Morrison's Island, well, there were a number of interesting things about that meeting. Champlain was very interested to know why the Algonquins, why here? This is stony ground. Yes, said the chief, but it's safe. Very hard for the Iroquois to attack here. And after, by the way, Champlain left Morrison's Island, his opinion of what we now know as the Ottawa Valley just deteriorated even further. He had nearly died a couple of times in rapids, the likes of which he had never seen. He looked for land that might be fertile, and all he said he saw were rocks, stones. The only good crop here were les bleuets, blueberries. Not a very favorable report. Fortunately, he went on. Maybe it was the loss of the astrolabe down near Cobden from which he didn't recover. He learned something else. And God bless our Aboriginal hosts and neighbors. Champlain at that meeting was trying to say nice things about Nicolas de Vignon, and he was surprised to get an immediate, vigorous, and negative reaction from the great chief. Vignon, a liar, an absolute, unreliable, cheating liar, which turned out actually to be the case. Harsh was the criticism that Vignon disappeared into the Canadian woods and was, as far as we know, never heard from again. But the river is a central part of this story because it explains the economy. It explains the society that developed around the economy, and perhaps even more interestingly, it explains the development of one of the most significant regional cultures anywhere in Canada. More about that in a moment. And Art Jameson's not in the room, so I suppose I have a little more license than, although Johnson is, and that's a worrisome thing for me. You know, because we live here, we just take it for granted. But a European would come and look at North America and be struck by a river that reaches 1,000 kilometers into the heart of the continent. This is the Danube. This is the Rhine. And a very convenient Danube and Rhine, because if you look at a map of North America, and imagine if you were looking at it 400 or 500 years ago, it's this incredible spear that just splits into the heart of a massive territory that allows people like Mackenzie and others to sweep from Montreal 4,500 kilometers northwest to Great Slave, from which they launched the last assault on not just the Pacific, but the Arctic Oceans. Huge geographic presence, and a watershed for the Ottawa of 8,000 square miles. We're told only about 12% of which was arable. And Champlain figured that out without having gone to Macdonald College at McGill University to take a degree in agriculture or agronomy. But there was one crop that it would grow, and it grew it in great abundance. And of course, if you were the great imperial power of the age, Britain, and the source of your power was the Navy, white pine particularly was a friend, because that is, of course, what sustained the great naval power in the world of 1800. A naval power that had finally vanquished Napoleon about that same time. And what, in fact, forced Europe to look to this part of North America was, in fact, the Napoleonic War that shut Britain off from the source of its timber supply for the Royal Navy. And it was because of that global conflict that Britain had to look westward to North America, which was, to quote the great Arthur Lower of Queen's University, Canada, Great Britain's woodyard. That is what brought the non-Aboriginal population here for purposes of my discussion tonight. By the middle of the 19th century, when John Egan, for example, was king of the Ottawa, employing about 3,800 people in the Ottawa Valley, there were 25,000 people working in the timber trade, which was at that time morphing into the lumber trade. And because of the nature of that crop, all of a sudden this part of Canada was very different than the rest of Canada, because the rest of Canada that was developing at that time, particularly in what we know as the central part of the country, was agricultural. If there was one thing about the Ottawa Valley, Great Britain's woodyard, that made it different, and there were other things that made it different, is it was not, by and large, an agricultural frontier. Now, telling that to somebody from Beachburg and Admaston will come as a little bit of a rude awakening, and I don't mean it in that sense. But most of the area that was to comprise the Ottawa Valley, or a good bit of it, was a borderland between the fertile St. Lawrence and Lower Ottawa Valley and the Precambrian Shield and the mining and God knows what other kind of hinterland was beyond North Bay. It also kind of added a mystery to the Ottawa Valley, because the economic basis of that region was different than the rest of the country as it was developing in those early decades of the 19th century. There's another element to the geography of the valley that is also interesting at this time, and that is it is bi-provincial. The river was not a dividing line so much as a tie that bound the communities together. Something more about that later, but that again it is a reality. And again, if you live here, in fact, there's a phrase that as I grow older really speaks to this. And if you're not from this area, a phrase we use in commonplace, I'll often have students at the University of Toronto and elsewhere say, well, what do you mean when you say the Quebec side? Well, how stupid are you? The Quebec side is the other side of the street. But it's also useful to remember at a critical point in the 19th century, and I don't want to dwell on this, but what we now know as Ontario and Quebec were together as the United Province of Canada. So in the particularly formative years of the post-rebellion period, 1840 to 1867, the province of Canada, as opposed to the Dominion of Canada, which comes in 1867, is Ontario and Quebec in the same harness. Not that you're going to remember your high school history, but a very quick little primer on that is, remember when the great English reformer came to post-rebellion Canada and said, because his job was to advise the imperial government, what the hell is going on? Those Canadians are now having rebellions? That sounds so American. These are not Americans. These are the United Empire Loyalists and others. Well, in fact, Lord Durham said, I came to post-rebellion Canada expecting to find a colonial people at war with an imperial government. And the famous phrase, that's not what I found, he said. I found, quote, two nations warring within the bosom of a single state. So the answer to that problem, which translated a little less diplomatically, how are we going to deal with those difficult French Canadians who don't seem to understand what 1759 was all about at those Plains of Abraham? Answer, well, we'll grant them democratic government. They then called it responsible government. And let's put them together in one united province. That way, the 20% Anglophone population of Quebec will meet up with the 100% Anglophone population of what is Ontario, and surely that will solve the problem. Well, guess what? It didn't. Because French Canadians discovered what some of Roy Reicke's friends in corporate capitalism know only too well, that in a widely held public company, 30% can be majority control. And as long as you hang together, they can't. By the way, this goes for a lot of our families as well. Have you ever had one of those family votes, 4-3? And the three decide to, like Martin Luther King, just sit down in the middle of the road and say, move me, I'm dead weight. You'll find out that your majority control is not quite what the numbers suggested. But the point I want to make is that if you think of the Ottawa Valley in the 19th century as it's developing, it is not an agricultural economy. It is timberland. It is a resource extraction that is not agricultural. It is bi-provincial. Sheenborough and Chapeau, really, how different are they than Douglas and Killaloe? Not very much then. Many would happily argue, not very much now. The other thing about the Ottawa Valley that I love this because it's not seen this way locally. Now, again, I'm not here to poke away at regional tensions, but you know, when I was in politics around here, there was sometimes almost a little bit of an anti-Toronto feeling. That some people in Nova Scotia and Alberta and the Yukon Territory would share. Well, one of the other things that's really interesting about the Ottawa Valley political culture is it should be thought of, the region should be thought of as the Toronto bypass, because it was. If you look at a map, if you were going west, why would you go through the lower Great Lakes and then up? If you help me, I should know. Who's your math teacher? The angle of the hypotenuse. The diagonal. It'll be the shorter way, and that's of course what the fur traders discovered. Montreal, Bytown, Pembroke, Mattawa, Georgian Bay, cuts about 400, 500, 600 miles off the trip. And the other reason to do that, of course, is that it keeps you away from the lower Great Lakes, where those Americans lurk. You know, they burnt Toronto, if you can believe that, during the War of 1812. That is what the American national anthem, by the way, is all about. We don't seem to know that. But the Ottawa Valley was the Toronto bypass. But because of the timber trade looked not to Toronto, never did. It looked to Ottawa, Montreal, Quebec City, and London, Liverpool. So the orientation of this part of central Canada, much of which was in Ontario, was for a very long period of time, mostly through the 19th century, it looked east, not southwest, to the center of the known universe, Muddy York, as it was once called, and now Toronto. By the time of Confederation in the 1860s, there was a very lively, dynamic at times uproarious community living in the Ottawa Valley. I'm going to just cite very quickly census data from 1911. I like it because it gives you a look at where the valley was at the end of the 19th century. And I want you to I'll read these very quickly. Listen to the split by virtue of language, culture, and race and religion here. In the Ottawa Valley here is basically both sides of the river from just south of Ottawa up to about Mattawa. There's about 400,000 people captured in this. I'll give you the general number and then just the Ontario number. And this is important for some of what's to come a little bit later. At basically the turn of the century, the population of the Ottawa Valley was 42% French, 26% Irish, 12% English, 10% Scottish, and a small percentage, not unimportant, American. On the Ontario side, the French drops from 42 to 30.5, the Irish at 30, English at 15, the Scottish at 12. Those are unusual data, particularly for Ontario. And if you look at religion, and one of the I raised with some care religion, but the 19th century was a time when religion was much more important in terms of people's self-identification and what they considered important in their lives and in the lives of the community. I'll just give the Ontario side. It doesn't, well, let me be both. So by religious split for the valley on both sides of the river, Roman Catholic 58%, Presbyterian 14%, Anglican 12%, Methodist 9%. On the Ontario side, Roman Catholic 48%, Presbyterian 17%, Anglican 15%, Methodist 11%. So all of this is just simply to say, in the Ottawa Valley, particularly overall, there are more Francophones around here than you're going to find in just about any place else in Ontario. There are more Catholics around. When we get into, if you were to drill down into this, in places like Renfrew County, there's a substantially greater German population. Pembroke at the Great War, 1 in 5 citizens is of German extraction. For my Irish friends here, one of the things that always surprises people is that at Confederation in 1867, 1 in 4 Canadians, and that includes all of Quebec, was of Irish background. In Ontario, by the turn of the century, of Irish in Ontario, 70% of Irish in Ontario were Protestant, not Catholic. So Douglas, I'm sorry to disappoint you. And just keep in mind some of those data because they will help make some of what I have to say quickly or soon, hopefully a little more understandable. So the Ottawa Valley in the 19th century and the timber trade grow together. One of the things about that economy that makes it also, there are several things that make it different. First of all, it's seasonal in a way that the agricultural industry isn't. Very volatile. You're subject to international markets, more so even than agriculture. And the lumber markets, the timber markets of the 19th century, the mid-century, were particularly volatile. Hard to regulate. Governments are small in these years. Can you imagine trying to, from Quebec City, Toronto, regulate what's going on at Bissett Creek? Not very easy. And some of the people attracted to the lumber and timber trade were almost genetically predisposed against regulation. A very male world, male-dominated, often isolated in shanties and camps a long way from the civilizing influences of women, the clergy, and a variety of other stabilizing forces. Away from home, very dangerous. As the angry spirit of the Ottawa Valley rivers stares us daily now, can you imagine before the great dams, those magnificent, one word, steel curtains or cement curtains that crossed the Ottawa, say, at Rapid de Suecia. Can you imagine what that must have looked like before the dams were built in high freshet? The great 19th century engineer Thomas Coltrane Kiefer was commissioned by the pre-Confederation government of Canada to go up to Stonecliff and say, why are so many people dying? There was one, I think it's the spring of 1845 or 54, that something like 50 men die on the river between Stonecliff and Deux-Rivières. This was a very dangerous business. One of Kiefer's recommendations is grog shops everywhere. Well, is it any wonder that somebody might wanted to visit the grog shop before they had to run a square timber raft anywhere near Les Rapides des Vachins or other of the many rapids along not just the Ottawa, but the Madawaska and some others. So a dangerous and violent world of physical violence, and as a result of that, sometimes a social violence. Not very well known. There's a wonderful literature on something called the Shiners' War. Anybody know what the Shiners' War is? Les Chaineurs? In the 1830s, a whole whack of Irish semi-skilled and unskilled workers are out of work because the Rideau Canal is completed, so they've got to get into the local economy. Well, how to do it? Well, the next best place, of course, is the timber trade. But that's already essentially being run by the Francophones. They're the king of that world. So a guy named Peter Aylen, very prominent fellow, Peter Aylen. Aylen Lake up here is named after, if not him, some of his family. He decides to organize in almost a union-like fashion a bunch of wild Irishmen who are trying to literally bang their way into a new job opportunity, and they unleash a social violence from Pembroke to Ottawa that most people today would be stunned to hear about. I won't bore you with all of those details, except to say, very famous Canadian writer, Charles Mair, born at New Lanark-on-the-Clyde, which is essentially Lanark Village, in the late 1830s. It goes on to quite a considerable renown as a writer. But he remembers, because his father was an early lumberman on the Mississippi and Lower Madawaska, and he remembers as a child in the early 1840s, terrified being in the Mair home as they were under attack by the Shiners. And he says, let me just read a couple of lines from Mair's testimony. I can see them yet, quote, this horde of semi-civilized savages from the wilds of Western Ireland, could this man be a Scot, armed with long pikes, mad with drink, threatening to destroy our home, and my father with stern bearing, barricading the door, loading the guns, and ready to take on all comers. It was a pretty wild place, and nowhere more so, ironically, than in Ottawa, a by-town, when all of these timber guys came out of those shanties. I mean, can you imagine? I hang around universities, and you get a bunch of those farm boys from Westmeath after being cooped up studying at Queen's University or elsewhere, and just let them loose. Well, can you imagine being in one of these shanties 200 miles above Ottawa up at the Damun or the Choya, and seeing women and wine and other inducements in Renfrew and Bytown? It was, what shall I say? Let me quote a couple of observers. Egerton Ryerson, the great Methodist church leader and educationalist, was very involved in his church. And one of his charges, the Reverend George B. Bucher, a circuit rider, came to Pembroke, Canada West in September of 1849. And his basic job was to report on the state of the spiritual health of people living in Pembroke circa 1850. He writes the following: My dear Ryerson, the pine tree is indeed, to all intents and purposes, the god of this demoralized community. Pembroke. At the shrine of this idol, here so generally adored, men sacrifice everything of which they are possessed: ease, health, comfort, piety, reputation, wife, children, God himself are all deliberately offered, my favorite phrase, as an awful hecatomb in these, the dark druidical groves of the Ottawa River Valley. End quote. I mean, it is obvious that Christian men of the faith have work to do. And I'm sure that he might have been overstating it. But then I read, almost at the same time, a young 25-year-old English doctor, Francis Cod. And he comes to Pembroke, Canada West, to set up shop in 1847. He writes several letters to his family back in Norfolk, England. And let me just, a few very brief selections. From Moffatville, Pembroke, Canada West, 12th February 1847, the following. Moffatville, beautifully situated on the south side of Allumette Lake. In the spring and fall, hundreds of rafts arrive here, bringing business. The country round about is not very civilized, and the roads, such as they are, push through the forest for several miles without a clearing to be seen. I do not think I can farm and practice medicine here. If I get paid at all, I will make a fortune, but only after many, many years. I am presently living in a tavern run by a Protestant Irish fellow. It gets a little more difficult as he gets a little bit on. June 19th, 1847, Pembroke. It is a miracle, Father, that the mail ever gets to this uncivilized place. The roads are unspeakably bad. I sold my horse and bought a small birch bark canoe from an Indian. It's more use to me than a horse and doesn't eat like the aforesaid. It also is good for rapids. Only the Indians here can make and mend them. Of this place, my dear parents, there is no part of Canada peopled by such savages. They are wild when stoked, fierce when provoked, and no law or civil power within 100 miles can control them. End quote. Now, I know he's embellishing. This can't be true, but I have a clergy person and a doctor reporting on the state of play in this lumber country, in the words of Reverend Bucher, deep in the dark druidical groves of the Ottawa. So, again, I don't mean to be frivolous, but you get a sense, I hope, that by mid-century, there has developed here a very strong regional culture. Yes, it is mostly about the timber and lumber trade. Out of that has developed a very distinctive early dialect, much more refined over the intervening 125 years, with its own folklore, its own music. Partly because of those census data I mentioned, a fairly strong ethno-cultural orientation. I'm trying to find the right words, and I'll come to somebody who does it better than I in a moment. And this is all adding up to people who are looking at this from Montreal and Toronto and Kingston and Perth as a kind of different place. A little exotic, certainly different, rowdy, getting a reputation, rowdy, rambunctious, colorful. And that leads me to two authors, and you'll know them both, the Nobel Prize-winning Alice Munro, in a book of a collection of short stories she published in 1990, Friend of My Youth, has an opening story of the same name. Now, Alice Munro's roots are in North Lanark. Let me just read a couple of lines from the Nobel laureate, Ms. Munro. She's describing a mother and a daughter who clearly very well could be her mother and herself, but it's a novel. It's just a short story. And the mother's talking. They're talking about a large, unornamented house whose wooden walls have never been painted. And this is in the area around Almont, but that had just been left to weather. Quote, "And when wood weathers in the Ottawa Valley," my mother said, "I don't know why, but it never turns gray. It always turns black." She often spoke of the Ottawa Valley, which was her home, in a dogmatic, mystified way, emphasizing things about it that distinguished it from any other place on earth. Houses turn black. Maple syrup there tastes like maple syrup nowhere else. Bears amble within sight of farmhouses. Of course, I, the daughter, was disappointed when I finally got to see this place, the Ottawa Valley. I found out it wasn't a valley after all, rather a scrambled, disarranged kind of country, with no easy harmony about it, not yielding readily to any kind of description, end quote. And then she goes off to talk about a particularly exotic radical sect, I think of Presbyterianism, called the Cameroonians, about which I know nothing. But it was just, again, a good example of that sort of hint. It's different, and sometimes interesting, and sometimes vaguely mysterious kind of ways. Robertson Davies, another very well-known bearded author of great renown, wrote a novel in 1985, which is actually set in Renfrew. Only Renfrew in this is Blair Logie. Anybody here ever heard of or read What's Bred in the Bone? Well, the first 50 pages, if you've got any connection to Renfrew, you'll read. And by the way, Robertson Davies' father owned, during the First War, the Renfrew Journal. And Robertson Davies grew up in Renfrew, didn't much like it, and I can't imagine they much liked him, based on what we know. But What's Bred in the Bone gives you his take, particularly on he essentially says, Blair Logie, Renfrew is a very interesting place because it seems he says that everything here is refracted through the prism of religion, language, and culture. Blair Logie, a rough country of vaguely peculiar people, he says in the novel. An upside down sort of place. Renfrew, or Blair Logie, and this is from my friend Irene, a wedding cake town with the Scots on top and a lot of people below. The prominent figure of Blair Logie, someone called Senator James Ignatius McCrory. I wonder who that could be modeled on. A Scot, born in the Hebrides, with a rich liberal with a French-Canadian wife, and one of his friends is Dr. Joseph Ambrosius Jerome, a leading Catholic physician who read books, Terry McCann, on the Index. He also read theology, and Dr. Jerome was, quote, someone who was more than a priest with a whiff of the devil about him. Now, again, I don't want to be, that's just how some people have cast us, in this case, in novel form, and young Mr. Reiki can say that's not true, and we know it not to be the case, but I simply cite that because if you look at some of the non-literary assessment, some of these aspects of the regional culture are very typical. There is a pattern, and I think there is some very real evidence. So before I get to my case studies, let me just say again, out of this economy, which comes from the geography and the lumber and the timber and the trees it grows, develops a strong regional culture, a regional community that does not look to Toronto, that is bi-provincial. It is very focused on the staple that is timber and lumber. There, issues of language, religion, and ethnicity matter. There is a certain muscularity about the place. There seems to be something in the culture that likes an independent streak. Colorful personalities seem to abound. There is a pattern of loquacity and oratorical misbehavior, as one of the person says, very storytelling people. You don't know any of those folks. The importance of the crown in this area is also, that is the government. If you think of, and Mike Johnson will know this, one of the things growing up here, especially if you grow up in the southwestern part of Renfrew County, you're astonished to find out that unlike most places in southern Ontario, it's unusual to have the Crown own 40, 50, 60% of the real estate. And we've got many places, there are many townships in this county where the Crown is far and away the biggest landowner. That's not a pattern of land ownership you see in much of the rest of southern Ontario. So the Crown, and it becomes important because I think it helps explain sometimes a creative tension between settlers and governments, whether they're in Toronto, Quebec City, or in Ottawa. So now let me talk to some of the issues about the political tradition that grows out of this. And one of the things that is interesting, at least to me, of course, and perhaps are families. And it's not unusual, but it seems to me particularly interesting that in 19th and much of the early 20th century, a lot of the politicians came from the same addresses. Peter White, longtime member of Parliament, Speaker of the House of Commons. His brother Andrew Thompson White, lumberman, member of the legislature in Toronto. Gerald Verner White, after his father dies, succeeds as the member of Parliament for North Renfrew, and for 30 years after he retires from the House of Commons, sits in the Senate of Canada. From 1875 to 1950, there was a White from Pembroke in the Parliament of Canada. That's close to a record. The Dunlops, Arunna Dunlop, Edward Arunna Dunlop, Edward Dunlop Jr., three members of one family, all members of the Ontario legislature, two of them from North Renfrew, one of them the decorated war hero. And if you remember Edward Dunlop Jr., he lost his sight as a result of a war injury sustained overseas. John Lorne McDougall Sr., John Lorne McDougall Jr., again, Scots from the Renfrew area. Families, I think, kind of my favorite for continuity. I mentioned earlier John Egan, King of the Ottawa, major timber lumber operator based in Aylmer, but all through this region, dies in 1855, but is the big operator at the time of his death. Also a member of the Pre-Confederation Parliament of Canada. His aide-de-camp, James Bonfield, Eganville. Later, Liberal MLA for South Renfrew. Well, he hands the job over to one of his sons-in-law, Dr. John F. Dowling. For those of you in Pembroke, anybody remember Colonel Fraser? The castle over on beautiful house. Loretta Fraser. Loretta Fraser is John F. Dowling's daughter. His other son-in-law, that is James Bonfield's other son-in-law, Martin James Maloney, also of Eganville. Anybody remember Dr. M.J. Maloney? Longtime Conservative MP. And then, of course, Dr. Maloney's two sons, James A. Maloney, Minister of the Crown in the Frost and Robarts governments, and then Arthur Edward Martin Maloney, QC, Member of Parliament for Toronto Parkdale. So that's not bad. Bonfield, Dowling, Maloney, and Maloney. And from about 1875 until, I guess, Jim died in 1961. The Quebec side, George Bryson Sr., a member of Parliament Pre-Confederation, appointed to the Senate of Quebec in 1867, held that office for 20 years, and then handed it off to his son George Jr. Meanwhile, his brother Tom was a member of Parliament, and son John was a member of the Quebec National Assembly. I think I've got that right. The Murray brothers in Pembroke. If you know the funeral home, Murphy Funeral Home, that was Tom Murray's house. Actually, you just have to look at the houses of these 19th century MPs to get a sense of their standing with some of their later day successors, and you have a measure of declining success, but that I won't get into that speaking personally. Tom and William Murray, one of their nephews, and maybe son, I don't know, somebody here, James L. Murray, who was a very important cog in the O'Brien Empire and ran as a candidate against Dr. Maloney in South Renfrew, married M.J. O'Brien's oldest daughter, Stella, if I'm not mistaken. So you see a pattern there. Robert Campbell from Douglas, an MP federally, succeeded provincially by his son, Robert Campbell, who had to make way in 1899 for a very prominent Ottawa lawyer, Frank Latchford, who was dropped in by the government to become Minister of Public Works to see to it that the Ontario Northland Railroad actually got built, which helped cost him his job in 1905. But the Campbells, Robert and Robert Jr., Thomas Mackey, Pembroke lumberman, MP, succeeded later by his son Herbert Mackey, Norman Reed, a Westmeath merchant and lumber agent, his son-in-law, Dr. John Cortland Bradley, mayor of Pembroke and member of the legislature at Queen's Park. One of the things I was struck by when I was looking at some material from the Eganville Leader was the obituary in 1915 when Pembroke Thomas Murray dies. He was born in Goulburn Township in Carleton in 1836, dies Pembroke in 1915. But just listen to this. Mr. Thomas Murray has been through 13 political campaigns, 5 in Pontiac and 8 in Renfrew County. He sat for 20, this is the obituary, he sat for 20 years in Parliament, part of that time in the local houses, yes, at both Quebec City and Toronto, and he served a 5-year term with his Pembroke address as the Member of Parliament for Pontiac. And that, I like that because it makes the point about the bi-provincial nature of this community. For many years, the member of the legislature in Quebec for Pontiac was David Gillies from Braeside in Carleton Place. And there was no confusing as to where he lived. Now, he had business interests in the Pontiac, but it is interesting how Charlie McCool, Ella Galligan's father, Sheen Township, was for 2 terms the MP for Nipissing. When he's beaten by George Gordon from Pembroke. Both McCool and Gordon sit for Nipissing. So you get a sense from the representation, and they're all mixed up in the lumber business. The lumber business in the Ottawa Valley sees no border. The McDougalls of Renfrew have substantial timber holdings in the Demon, not in the province of Ontario after Confederation. I've gotten a little ahead of myself. Again, the politics of this era, for much of the time, from the 1850s through till certainly well into the 20th century, if you looked at the who's representing the area, it is the lumber kings. I've mentioned a number of them already. John Egan, King of the Ottawa. James Bonfield, his agent, becomes the provincial member for South Renfrew. South Renfrew's member of Parliament at Confederation, Daniel McLaughlin, who had been an MP for both Ottawa and Renfrew in the pre-Confederation era. I've mentioned the Whites and the Mackeys and the Brysons. One of the great lumber king after Egan dies in 1856 or 57, of course, is John Rodolphus Booth. Now, Booth himself was never in politics, But anybody here from Admaston might remember very prominent, high-profile, highly regarded Conservative MP, John Ferguson. And it was interesting in the story of Renfrew, very good local history, now 70, 80, 90 years old, by William Smallfield and Dr. Ferguson. The following is said of John Ferguson, MP, brought up on a, quote, he was brought up on a farm, but at 20 years of age, struck out into the woods. Young Mr. Ferguson did well in his pursuit, in large part because unlike so many other men, other young men of that era, he did not yield to the spendthrift temptations. One only can imagine what it meant to yield to the spendthrift temptations offered by the Ottawa Valley bush. When he was defeated by another great character, I didn't have a picture of him, Aaron Abel Wright. Looks like one of those biblically, he has a beard that anticipates Robertson Davies 75 years later. When he was defeated, Ferguson, in 1900 by A.A. Wright, he is quoted, Mr. Ferguson, as saying, quote, "I am not a whit sadder, but a much richer and more comfortable man for being out of Parliament." A rather sanguine observation about what had been a very successful career. A couple of others that I will just mention in passing. Not all of these elected people representing the region were, of course, members of Parliament. We had senators. I mentioned Senator George Bryson, very prominent Quebec-based lumberman, was in the Quebec Legislative Council, the Quebec Senate. M.J. O'Brien. M.J. O'Brien, appointed by his Nova Scotian friend, Robert Borden. Terry will probably know this. O'Brien grew up in Nova Scotia, and somewhere early on, he meets and engages Robert Borden as his lawyer. Borden is prime minister in 1919 and encourages and finally talks MJ, who wasn't too interested, in taking what was then known as the Irish Catholic seat for Ontario in the Senate. And he sits for a number of rather, I think, unsatisfying years. But there were a number. I mentioned George Gordon from Pembroke, who was the MP from Nipissing. When he decides to leave Parliament, he accepts an appointment to the Senate. Now, I also just want to touch again on a couple of the other consequences of the regional culture that I mentioned, and that is the ethno-cultural manifestation and the political reality of the time. Peter White, a very prominent, successful, long-time MP, is defeated in Pembroke, in North Renfrew in 1896, and not by much. Because like a true Valley native, he has a fairly significant independent streak, and he does not like what his government has done in Manitoba. If you remember, in the Manitoba schools crisis, the federal government, led by the Grand Master of the Orange Lodge, decides to restore denominational school rights to Manitoba against the advice of Wilfrid Laurier, if you can believe that, as anomalous as it sounds. And Peter White says, I don't agree. And he pays with it for his job, because the evidence, according to his biographer, is that in this very heterogeneous population, remember those religious and ethnic divisions in North and South Renfrew? And Peter White, when he lost to Thomas Mackey, and when Thomas Mackey lost to Peter White, they were losing by 50 and 60 votes out of 4,000 and 5,000 votes cast. It didn't take much to move you from the winning to the losing circle. I mentioned earlier the point about M.J. O'Brien. Frank Latchford was brought to South Renfrew by Mr., well, it wasn't Mowat, it was George Ross, actually, because there was a spot in the cabinet of Ontario for much of the 19th and first half or so of the 20th century for an English-speaking Roman Catholic. Oftentimes, that candidate, either Liberal or Conservative, came from South Renfrew. And again, on this balance, again, today it seems very anomalous, but I remember my grandfather saying to me that he was recruited in 1929 to be the Liberal candidate in South Renfrew because A, he was from the west end of the riding, and he was Catholic. Tom Lowe was going to be running federally. He was a good Methodist from Renfrew. And that's the way they thought. You balanced the offering geographically, linguistically, or religiously, because you were trying to build a coalition. And you had to get to a certain number of votes to win. And the major parties were mostly interested in winning. Paul Yakubuski in 1963 was a masterstroke, although it didn't appear that way to a lot of people, including people in his own Conservative Party. Because all those Polish people in West Renfrew happened to be, for good or for ill, they tended to vote in large numbers for the Liberals. Finally, somebody figured out, well, I wonder what would happen if you gave them one of their own to vote for and not in perhaps the traditional party. And we found out the most successful vote getter that the South Renfrew Conservatives ever found. Probably going to be exceeded by his son, but we don't know that yet. Joe Green, in a similar kind of way, the Liberals federally would always, Arnprior was hopeless. Every Tory in creation seemed to live in Arnprior. The Liberals would just typically give up on it. Well, what would happen if you could find a credible candidate who was willing to be seen in the Liberal tent from Arnprior? Well, actually, some guy from Renfrew County Council, formerly on Arnprior Town Council, named Joe Green, offered to do that job, and in 1963 and 1967, or 1965, again in very close combat with James W. Baskin from Renfrew, won. But it's this notion of politics that if it was doing its job, tried to understand what is our constituency locally, and how can we recruit and offer candidates who spoke to that. So now let me get to, again, a couple of very specific case studies. But before I do, there's a couple of other ones, all in the family. Sometimes I mentioned these families, but sometimes all in the family became a little bit of a challenge. Peter White, for example, in his second election, the election result was overturned. So there was yet another one of these contested elections, and I'll talk a little more about that in a moment when I get to the South Renfrew battle that really fought out at Brudenell in 1872. What did Peter White do? Well, Peter White went to see some prominent lumbermen, and he was a lumberman, the Bronsons in Ottawa, and said, listen, you and I both know, we may be on the other side of politics, but you know that I'm going to be a more credible representative for the lumber interest in Parliament than either of those Murray boys from Pembroke. And he must have made a very strong case because the Bronsons agreed, and as a result of that agreement, Peter White was successful in probably his toughest election in the early going. But there was an example of what you saw in this lumber community because their politics was lumber. And they were constantly looking at who would be the strongest representative for that regional interest that was, for much of the rest, particularly of Ontario, seemed to be something a little beyond the pale. Remember, 19th century, early 20th century, we're a very rural place. And so it's a place of farmers. Well, who are these lumbermen? Aren't these lumbermen the bane of all the farmers? And they were in many places. So that example I just found interesting. There's a great case involving two families in North Lanark, the McLarens and the Caldwells. Peter McLaren, a very prominent conservative, he's a lumberman. His neighbors, the Caldwells, are liberals, and they're in the lumber business. McLaren makes improvements on the Mississippi River and decides that he's not going to let the Caldwells bring their lumber, their logs down the Mississippi because he's made the improvements, and to hell with them. Well, Peter McLaren is very well known to the Conservatives, and he is soon to become a Conservative senator in Ottawa. The Caldwells are ably represented by one of their own, William James Caldwell, longtime Liberal MPP for North Lanark. And so what happens? Well, the Ontario government decides there's a court case, and the court case is decided in favor of McLaren. You've got the right to stop certain people from using the river without certain conditions being met. The Ontario government responds, we are going to introduce legislation, the Rivers and Streams Act, and we're going to overturn that piece of... Johnny MacDonald in Ottawa responding to his friend Peter McLaren at Carleton Place, to hell with you, we're going to use the federal power of disallowance. We're not going to allow that law to be passed. Back 1, 2, 3, it's like a ping pong game. Finally, this local fight between Ottawa Valley lumbermen in the same Scottish North Lanark family ends up before the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. And God damn it, said MacDonald, that bunch of liberal British, mostly Scottish jurists, yet again side for Ontario. But you get a very important constitutional case out of this local lumber fight about the riparian rights on the Mississippi River and whether or not the McLarens can charge the Caldwell. So sometimes these family relations weren't just as collegial as you might imagine. Now there's an even more interesting one. Most of you probably have never heard about this. So at 1900, who are the MPs? And, well, they're the Whites and the Dunlops. All of the local members up here, they're all lumbermen. So it's 1904, the South African War is over. The government of Canada decides, well, we need a bigger, better military training ground. And they decide it has to be not far from the national capital. And the two places that end up on the short list are Barry's Bay, South Renfrew, and Petawawa, North Renfrew. The Eganville leader says, the case could not be clearer. It must be Barry's Bay. The Pembroke Observer says, not so. It has to be Petawawa, surely. And the government of Canada is sitting there saying, well, we really don't. And then I should add, the 1904 general election comes along. Surely the case is now settled. The Laurier government has been re-elected. What do you mean? The South Renfrew Liberals did their duty. They elected A.A. Wright. That should settle the case. Because what did they do in Pembroke and Petawawa? They threw Tom Mackey out and put Peter White back in. Well, given the political calculus of the time, case settled in favor of South Renfrew and Barry's Bay. No. Case awarded to Petawawa. So, without getting into all the details, one of the reasons, and it was a good reason, the government said there are many fewer settlers to buy out in Petawawa than there are up there in West Renfrew, and that'll make it cheaper for Her Majesty. So they send the agents out to start buying it, and the people affected are recently arrived German settlers up in the sand plains of Petawawa. I mean, you got to think in some ways this might have been a bit of a blessing because the agricultural potential of the sand plains of the Petawawa are not obvious. And having spent a few years and $40,000, they get a deal affecting, I think, about 200 residents and farmers. Well, it's almost done. Oh, no, it's not done. There are other property interests. Well, what other property interests? Timber licensees. Because, of course, this is the lower Petawawa, very good pine country. And the timber licensees make very plain, no $40,000 is going to buy us out. $112,000 or bust. Well, now that gets the attention of the gang in Ottawa. They start a negotiation. It's not going very well. And then one day, the Minister of National Defence, he was then called Militia, stands up in Parliament and says, Mr. Speaker, the debate about the Petawawa lands is ended. The lumber barons in Pembroke are gobsmacked. How could they be ended? We're a long way from settled. Oh, they're ended because I, on behalf of Her Majesty, will now invoke Section 117 of the British North America Act, which gives the Dominion government the right, in the defense of the realm, to take lands required for the defense of the country. We so acquire Petawawa. Get stuffed. And let me tell you, there was an unholy row and squeal over that. And it's just, again, a reminder of how these things sometimes worked out. So I want to quickly go through, and I guess, James, you can throw something at me. I'm probably, yes, getting close to. South Renfrew, a couple of these elections that are really interesting. 1872, the second Dominion election. Country is just, that is the Confederation country. And by the way, you know, and I don't mean to slight Canada 150, but the way we talk about the history of Canada is that before 1867, there was an abyss. And then it's like Genesis, let there be light. They met at Charlottetown. Queen Victoria cast her wand, and something called Canada was created. No, not really. 1867 is just an admission that Lord Durham didn't quite get it right. It took 25 years to say, this is the fourth or fifth arrangement, didn't quite figure it out, so let's try again. So the second election, and elections in the, this is the last election of the open vote. This idea that you go to vote in the privacy of a ballot box, oh no, that was very, very modern. In 1872, you got to go to an open poll. And you had to cast your vote in front of your employer, your neighbor, any number of people. And so the two combatants are the incumbent, John Lorne McDougall, a double gold medalist from the University of Toronto in mathematics, I want you to know, 1859. Came back to Renfrew to join his father, who soon dies, in the milling and lumber business, and just a big wheel around Renfrew and elsewhere. He's both the, you could before 1872, both be the MP and the MLA for the same riding, and John Lorne McDougall was that in South Renfrew. Won quite handsomely when he had to get elected, which is important to keep in mind for what comes in 1872. So he's the incumbent, he's a prominent businessman, Scots Presbyterian, prominent, highly regarded. Father was a bit of a Highland chief, a little more aristocratic, I think, was the father among a very big landowner. But anyway, a very highly regarded guy was his son, John Lorne McDougall. Later on becomes Auditor General of Canada for 25 years. So I had quite a successful career. One year that was not very happy or successful was 1872, because in 1872, Johnny MacDonald is under great pressure from the Catholics in Ontario. They want more representation in his new Dominion government. And they think this riding South Renfrew is just ready for the picking. And the Presbyterians have enough to do and enough to say, and government's liberal and conservative, it seems. So it's time to get an Irish Catholic elected. Well, who might that be? Well, there is in Kingston a very prominent lawyer, director of the Kingston and Pembroke Railway, the federal prosecutor that put the assassin of Thomas D'Arcy McGee to the gallows, a guy named James O'Reilly, very prominent Irish Catholic lawyer, and so he agrees. And so the campaign, which by the way runs over several weeks, the idea, secret ballot, one place, one day, no. This runs over several days, weeks. If you're the government, you appoint the returning officer, and the returning officer's job is to be as partisan as possible, regardless of which party appointed him, to make sure that every possible advantage this side of the law, and the other side of the law for that matter, is allowed. And so away we go. And it is quite a show. It is quite, early returns are, all manner of mayhem has occurred. They had to throw a bunch of the O'Reilly people out of the poll at Admiston because these Catholics were trying to keep local Catholics from voting for their man McDougall, who they quite liked. But that was nothing, given the reports they were hearing from the back country, because the Conservatives, just as the Liberals would have done if they'd had the chance, just before the elections called, they affect what do we call a gerrymander? No, that's what they wouldn't, a riding realignment. And they take 5 frontier townships. You'd know them today as Sherwood, Jones, Burns, Haggerty, and Richards. And they move them from North Renfrew, or wherever. Actually, they were Nipissing, I suppose, because this really is the borderland. And they stick them on to South Renfrew. And the McDougall people rightly think this doesn't augur well for us. And it didn't. Because when the McDougall people decide to go to Brudenell, and there's a very large influx of Polish Catholics at the same time as this election. And the McDougall people know that probably isn't a good sign either, and it wasn't. So there's a party of McDougalites who leave Renfrew for Eganville, Foymount, and they don't ever get to Brudenell because they're confronted up at a hostelry someplace about the intersection of Highway 512 and 515. No. And there are guns firing, blood, sirens, all manner of, it's like the Civil War from the descriptions. No, you can't go any further. Not allowed. And if you try, there will be real trouble. And then the guns start, they didn't shoot at anybody, but they showed close enough. The next thing, the McDougall people hightail it to Renfrew. The poll at Brudenell is taken, and the numbers are O'Reilly 408, McDougall 6. And, well, it's an election, you never know. So, of course, O'Reilly wins the election, and we then learn a couple of months afterwards, and MacDonald wins the election. He becomes very narrow, and it is the election that gives birth to the Pacific Scandal, and that's another story. But when they start looking into the South Renfrew result, the great Edward Blake, probably the greatest lawyer in Canada at the time, he leads the charge in Parliament asking questions. Question to the government. We have the returns now from southwest Renfrew. How is it possible there was just a census? There was just a census in that part of the world, and apparently 4 times as many people voted in Sherwood Township as live in Sherwood Township. And on it went. It gives you a flavor for the campaign. Now, let me just quickly move to a provincial by-election. My favorite of them all is Pembroke 1903. This one is a provincial by-election. And this is Eddie Dunlop's first success. Edward Dunlop, his father. And by the way, if you were in politics, or even if you were just a citizen, you would think this is a business you might want to avoid. Why was there a by-election in North Renfrew provincially in 1903? Actually, the by-election day was Boxing Day. It was December 26th. Can you imagine having an election on Boxing Day? But they did. Well, for the third time in 10 years, an incumbent died. Edward Dunlop's father, Aruna Dunlop, got elected in 1890, died 2 years later. Peter White's brother, Andrew Thompson White, gets elected provincially as a Conservative in 1898. He dies 2 years later. Another by-election, I think. The provincial general election in Ontario, 1902, is 29th of May. A Liberal from Pembroke, another well-known name, James W. Munro. He wins. He dies 2 days after the election. So you would have thought the life insurance community would have gotten together and say, Johnson, Mask, O'Grady, don't go there. The omens are very bad here. This could be a very short-lived experience. So we have a by-election. This one takes 19 months to occur. Things are not going well for the provincial Liberals at Queen's Park. The premier is a fellow named George Ross. He'd gotten elected to Parliament federally in 1872 with a very feisty guy from Pembroke named James Finlay, who was the editor of the Pembroke Observer. He's still around, and he's not very impressed with how well or poorly his old seatmate or colleague federally, George Ross, is making out as Premier of Ontario. So when they have the first big meeting and George Ross shows up in Pembroke, the first person to greet him is his old colleague, James Finlay, who then berates him for backsliding on the liquor question. You used to be for temperance, and now you're not. You used to be for honest government. You seem to be now for everything but. This does not go very well. The Liberals nominate, of course, Edward Dunlop is Pembroke establishment, business, professional, lumber mostly, but Pembroke Electric Light and a number of other things. His opponent is another 27-year-old Pembroke lumberman named Lorne Hale. 27. The Pembroke Observer said, quote, of Lorne Hale, the worthy son of a worthy sire. The Renfrew Mercury says, balderdash. It looks like in North Renfrew, only the timber barons have the right to represent us in Parliament, and we need more than, quote, the men of the wad. And so the by-election, they're waiting for it to be called. The provincial scene is almost even, and Ross is very reluctant to call an election because he's afraid if this thing flips, I'm a goner. So a few weeks after the session opens, the Conservative member from Manitoulin, a guy named Robert Gamey, surprises everybody by announcing, I'm changing sides. I'm now a Liberal because my politics are Manitoulin. Well, that gives Ross some comfort, until a few months later, Mr. Gamey says, well, I didn't tell you the whole story. I changed because the Minister of Natural Resources greased my palms with several $1,000s and as much patronage as I could dispense. Well, I don't need to tell you what that did. And it was against the backdrop of the so-called gamey affair that the North Renfrew by-election takes place in the fall of 1903. And they're all here. Not only all of the politicians, the Globe is here, the Toronto Telegram's here, the Montreal Star, because this is better than professional wrestling. Gamey comes to Pembroke and says, they're trying to kill me. They've broken into my hotel room. The Pembroke Observer is in the Globe saying, our presses have been interfered with. The best part of the story actually is buried in the archives of the now Royal Bank. There was a young banker in Ottawa, and the Lumberman's Bank, by the way, was the Bank of Ottawa, which was taken into the Bank of Nova Scotia. There's a young guy who actually left some very interesting paper. I didn't find it, but a friend of mine found it, and it was quite remarkable. He's a young guy from the Maritimes. He comes to Ottawa, and he says, I wasn't there very long, and it was our Liberal friends in Pembroke. And by the way, in those years, it wasn't like it is now. Each bank could print its own banknotes. Now there's a standard banknote. But the Bank of Ottawa had a $5 note or a $10 note, and the Merchants Bank of whatever. He said, I was literally taking bagfuls of money up to the candidate in Pembroke and giving it to him and saying, surely you want to count this before. Why would I count it? I have no intention of counting it when I hand it out by the mittful later today. And it is, whether or not true, it does suggest that in that era, election financing as we know it was a very underdeveloped art. At that point, suffice it to say, the election returns come in on Boxing Day. Ross and the Liberals are buried, and Edward Dunlop's career begins. It becomes very successful. 25 years later, actually, he has another by-election because he's summoned to cabinet, and his opponent in that by-election is a young Pembroke fellow named Paul Martin. And Paul Martin, the only election he ever loses is one that he loses here in Pembroke in June of 1928. Well, I'm going to cut this short with a couple of other very quick examples. And they have to do with two people that are more recent, Charlotte Whitten and Joe Green. And before I do, there are some political names that have gone on to very considerable acclaim from here, but no connection here in terms of their public life. I always like to say, Pembroke, or not Pembroke, actually Lake Dory in this case, we may not like Toronto, but we actually elected one of the most, we gave birth and succor in the early years, Bill Dennison, Mayor of Toronto. Some of you the Dennisons from Lake Dory. His daughter, Lorna Milne, was somebody I know. She was an MP her husband was an MP. She was appointed a senator. But Bill Dennison, actually, and before he became mayor of Toronto, he left Lake Dory, went to Toronto, decided he'd run for the Ontario legislature, and he won a couple of terms. And one of the people he beat to get there was a young guy named Roland Michener. So Bill Dennison, mayor of Toronto, Pembroke roots. Beachburg, Percy Wright, became a very important CCF member of Parliament from Saskatchewan, born in Beachburg, Ontario. Charlie McRae, anybody ever driven through Springtown? Sort of suburban Calabogie. And I think the McRae farm is Silent Point. I think that was the actual McRae property. Charlie McRae grew up, went to school in Renfrew, went north like so many people did, the turn of the last century, became a very important, very powerful minister of mines for many years, based in Sudbury. Charlotte Whitten. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but I tell you, when I think about independence, color, pugnacity, Charlotte Whitten, born in Renfrew in 1896, of a very, as Ed Broadbent would have said in the old days, an ordinary Canadian. Sociologists might say very kind of regular working class. There was no hand of preference over Charlotte's head. She was just smart. She was a very good student at Renfrew Collegiate, and a very good athlete. She went to Queen's University. She was an even better student at Queen's. By the way, her friends at Queen's had a name for her. They called her Black Minorca, after that black feathered chicken. You know, that chicken that is, most of all, a fighter and a crower. And if you knew anything about Charlotte, she was an exceptionally talented woman, very bright. When she was at Queen's, she did extremely well. An amazing networker. She was, when most people were struggling to get and keep a job, as a woman in the 1920s and 30s, earning a very, very good salary, running something called the Canadian Welfare Council. She had, at Queen's, had a number of professors who went on to basically be the modern bureaucracy in post-World War I Ottawa. She knew them all very well. One of the people she met early on was R.B. Bennett, who was a friend and supporter of hers all his life. Her friends, strangely, were quite ecumenical. Her father was an ardent conservative. She ended up working for Tom Lowe, the Liberal member from South Renfrew and Minister of Trade and Commerce in the King government in the 1920s. But anyway, she leaves her social work career in the 1940s, is thinking about what to do, and someone says, Charlotte, we need a woman on council. And in 1950, she runs successfully for Ottawa Board of Control. And for the next 20 years, she's either a high-profile Board of Control, or for 9.5 years, a mayor like Ottawa has never seen before or since. Somebody I know once described Charlotte. It was one of the men on the council, who was later to become Speaker of the House of Commons, said, I had never met anyone like her. And he was constantly going to get legal advice, Terry, to launch another legal action for defamation of character. And he said, I finally stopped doing that because I had a constituent write me with a letter and said, oh, Mr. So-and-so, you should think of our mayor, Ms. Whitten, as simply this. And I hope this wasn't sexist. I think it was a woman who wrote the letter. Think of Ms. Whitten as, quote, that woman without a single unspoken thought. And that was Charlotte. I mean, if she was thinking it, she was going to tell you. And it would not necessarily be bundled in any particularly diplomatic way. Paul Tardif was somebody on council that she loathed, and one of the reasons she didn't like him was she thought he was in the pocket of the young, very aggressive Ottawa developer named Robert Campo. By the way, what she did with Campo was when Campo would come to make yet another pleading at council, Roy, she had a pistol in the desk, and she'd sometimes just take the pistol out, and when she finished berating him, she'd wave the pistol. Imagine doing that today, you know. In fact, when she died, they actually found a pistol in her effects. And somebody I know close to this scene said, oh my God, was that the pistol she had at City Hall? I don't think so. But someone who knew her, I have to tell you this quick story, and I'm probably guilty of the same thing here tonight. Diefenbaker was always trying to get her to run. She was a committed conservative by this point. And this is Charlotte in some respects. So it's 1957. She's taking a break from municipal politics. There's a federal election coming. Dief says, Charlotte, will you run in Renfrew South? Maybe, sir, maybe I need to think about this. So they call the nomination. And they buy radio time because the leader is going to be there for I think a nationally televised or a regionally televised radio address at, I think, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Whatever it is, all the proceedings have to be over by 3 o'clock, so Mr. Diefenbaker gets the microphone. Charlotte is the last to get up at about 20 to 3. She takes an hour and 15 minutes to make a speech, the last line of which is, I'm sorry, sir, but after a lot of consideration, I cannot oblige your request. At which point, somebody like Bramburger from the radio station leans over and says, sir, you have 3.5 minutes left of your radio time. Mr. Diefenbaker was not impressed. A year later, she decides to run against her own lawyer, George McElwraith, whose campaign financier was her brother-in-law, Frank Ryan of CFRA, and she loses in another family affair that is not particularly happy. But at the end, I thought this also comes back to something I was trying to make earlier. A young fellow who was the son of one of Charlotte's longtime friends and classmates at Queen's, Grant Cameron, said of Charlotte, think about an Ottawa Valley personality. He said, Charlotte, she was a real conundrum. Quote, a mixture of delight and terror. She could be such a grand lady at a garden party with the Queen. But oh my God, she could be the Renfrew comet, spitting sparks and gunpowder in all directions. And in a way, she was that. So last story, before I shut this down, involves Joe Green. And this story, Joe was, of course, Toronto-born, worked in Northern Ontario, was a flight lieutenant in the Second War, won the Distinguished Flying Cross, comes back from the war, goes to law school. Somewhere along the way, meets Corinne Bador from Arnprior. They're married and off to Arnprior he goes about 1950 to put out his legal shingle. It was like McCann and Foran would have done. And shortly thereafter, he's recruited to town council and then to county council. And some of you here, I know Terry certainly, and many of you will remember Joe. He was called the Abe Lincoln of the Ottawa Valley. And it's so interesting because he was quite a distinctive character. But this was learned. Like Joe Green grew up in Toronto, but he had a very folksy kind of charm. He liked to meet people. He was a candidate for the Liberal leadership in 1968, which was won by Trudeau the Elder, we now say. And Green made far and away the best speech of that convention, as anybody who'd seen him in church halls in Griffith and Killaloe and any place. I remember seeing him and watching that and said, well, what was so good about that? That's the standard Joe Green pitch. Anyway, Joe was a federal minister of agriculture. That too is an interesting story. Joe going around the country as a Toronto-born lawyer trying to carry on like he knew one end of the cow from another. He did a damn good job, actually, of giving effect to that. His health was not good. He ended up having to leave politics, was appointed to the Senate, but he died at a relatively young age of 58 in 1978. But John Matheson, a few years ago, John also was a colleague of his. John, by this point, is a judge, but he served a few years as a member, a Liberal MP from Brockville in Leeds. And he was speaking at the John A. Macdonald dinner in Kingston. It's held every year, McDonald's, the anniversary of McDonald's death. And John was speaking to the audience about McDonald's view about the importance of loyalty. I know you'll be with me when I'm wrong, or when I'm right, but will you be with me when I'm maybe not quite right? Which is what most prime ministers and leaders need to know sometimes in the tribal business of politics. And of course, Matheson did a great job of explaining the genius of McDonald, as it was the genius of Brian Mulroney in understanding the loyalty bond between the leader and the parliamentary caucus, without which there is no government, without which the leader is at sea. And poor Mike Pearson, however many Nobel Prizes he won, it just didn't seem to, he just constantly seemed to be having problems with his government and leaks and all the rest of it. And he says, so Matheson said, it was becoming a very real problem. And one day in caucus, Joe Green, the member from, not yet in cabinet, the member from Renfrew got up and and Pearson was the classic Ottawa Mandarin. He'd been schooled in the Department of Foreign Affairs. He was a diplomat, a bureaucrat. He wasn't like Paul Martin Sr. and others of that who were incubated in party politics. So Matheson says, after one particularly devastating leak one week when the Pearson government circa 1964 is rocking wildly in the waters, being ably stirred by John George Diefenbaker, the leader of the opposition, Joe Green stood up in caucus and said, quote, you know, Prime Minister, you should fire the whole kit and caboodle of them, meaning the public service. Throw the buggers right out. Pearson was stunned, looked at the caucus and said, my God, what is he saying? Joe, he said, how could we possibly run the government without the gifted people of the Canadian public service? No problem, Prime Minister, said the honourable member for South Renfrew. Give me a few days, I'll get I get 2 or 3 truckloads of replacements in 2 weeks from Killaloo. Maybe they're not the brightest people around, but by God, I can tell you they're loyal. End quote. End of story. Loyalty, color, independence. Tell it as it is. Sorry, Jamie, we have screwed up the order here because I told him I was going to do this in about 45 or 50 minutes. I've gone on far too long. Anybody want a question or comment if we have any time, and we probably don't?
No, there's always time. I will say that if Sean Conway ever asks you to be his operator for a slide presentation, say no. That was terrific. Thank you very much.
I knew about that.